Hey there folks, Tim Slade here, and welcome back to the ATD Ask a Trainer video series. In today's episode, my special guest Cara North and I are answering your questions about common learning myths. So stay tuned. If there's one constant that exists within our industry, it's that folks like to cling on to ideas and concepts and methodologies that are often proven to be untrue. And for reasons that make absolutely no sense to me whatsoever, these myths have a way of constantly re-emerging and living on, despite them being proven false again and again and again. And so that's why I decided to invite Cara North to help me tackle and debunk some of your most common questions about common learning myths. So let's get to it. Hey, Cara North, thank you so much for joining us for this month's ATD Ask a Trainer episode. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you, Tim?
I'm doing fantastic. For those of who's watching who don't know, Cara North and I know, we've been following each other online for however long, but we only met in person the first time, I think. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it was ATD ICE in DC back in, was it 2019 before the pandemic?
No, it was before
Did we
that.
meet before
I
that?
guess I must be forgettable.
Oh,
Yeah,
no.
we met in 2018 in Phoenix, TLDC.
Oh, that's right. I totally forgot about that. Yes, we did meet at TLDC. I totally forgot about, because it's been a while since they've done that, and we
so long.
we haven't done that. Yeah. Okay, so we go back further than I realized. Yes, because I was still working at GoDaddy at the time, and you were helping run the TLDC conferences. So we go back a little bit of ways. But one of the things I've always appreciated about you is you like to tell it how it is. And to put it kindly. And the reason why I chose to have you on this month's episode is because I think with a lot of the learning myths out there, and there are tons of learning myths out there, sometimes it helps to have somebody who can tell it like it is. And so I'm happy to have you.
I'm glad that's my purpose, but let's do it. I'm excited.
Okay, cool. All right, well, let's get to our first question. So our first question comes from Karthik Richard. Hey, Karthik. And Karthik wants to know, is it true that learning styles aren't a thing, or do we just not have enough evidence to prove their usefulness? And one thing I'll say before we jump into this, we have a lot of questions on learning myths today, but I want to point out that I don't assume that people are really asking these questions because they don't know, but I think they're probably asking because they want to help us debunk them. So I should mention that before we jump in. So I don't know, Cara, what do you think about learning styles? I mean, that's like the number one learning myth people still tend to propagate out there.
Yeah, so let's just kind of deconstruct and talk about maybe why learning styles is kind of a thing, right? I think that it is so ingrained kind of in the K through 12 culture. You hear about it in school. I think it's still in a lot of formal education programs. So I think that's kind of where it comes from. And at the sense, I mean, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense that people might have something that they prefer. And I think that is the key word here, Tim, is prefer, right? So I may prefer to get something audio, or I may prefer to get a video, etc., right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that biologically I learn differently from you because I have a preference, right? So that's where learning styles for me kind of loses and goes off the rails, because biologically we learn the same way. It's not necessarily what we prefer, but I don't think that basically because somebody does something one way or takes something in a certain way that means that they learn better or differently from somebody else. And two, if you think about it, gosh darn, it is really hard to hit all of those for everybody, for everything that we create, right? So if they were really a thing, gosh, we'd really have to be doing double, triple, quadruple duty in a lot of the stuff we make, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, to your point, learners might have a preference on receiving content or how they receive that content, but I think it's more about the context or the nature of the content they're receiving. So, for example, depending on what's being taught, if I'm being taught a hands-on task, yes, I would like to see it, but that is not that's less about to do with my preference. It's more about the nature of what's being taught, right? And so I think sometimes people misconstrue that. Well, if it's best taught with a hands-on experience, those learners are hands-on learners. No, maybe the skill it needs to be taught with a hands-on, experiential activity for it to be best be taught. It's more about the content, less about the learner preference. Would you agree with that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree, and absolutely. And if somebody wants to dive a little bit deeper into this, I know Clark Quinn has a great book that touches on this. It's ATD Press, Millennials, Goldfish, and Other Myths, I think is what it's called. But that's a great book to go to. Dr. Will Thalheimer has a lot of great stuff out there, and I actually think there's a challenge out there. If you can prove that learning styles are real, you can actually win money, Tim. I
Oh,
think it's up to like $5,000 or $6,000 now. If you can prove it, that you can win
oh,
money.
that's
So
interesting. I didn't know that. I'll have to
yeah.
check that out. And for anyone who's curious, there was a I think it's a 2014 study by the American Psychological Association. They did some research that showed there is no correlation to learners' preferences and outcomes as it relates to the delivery of the content. So there's research that says learning styles aren't a thing. So before we move on to the next question, so if learning styles aren't a thing, they're not. What should we, as instructional designers, learning professionals, be doing instead?
Oh, that's a great question. Really, I think we need to focus on what are the outcomes of what it is that we want to accomplish with our learning experiences. So, if you're in higher education, you want to make sure that those learning experiences align to the program goals of that particular class in that particular program for the accrediting body. If you're in a corporate setting, you want it to be tied to a business goal. You want it to be tied to what somebody actually does on the job. Like, what do they actually need to do
Hmm.
in that? And again, really remember anchoring them in the learning experience. The go to what's in it for me, making sure that they know exactly what it is that they need to do. If you focus more on action based versus kind of these other things, I do think that you're going to be better
Yeah,
off.
I totally agree. Yeah, the thing about learning styles is it's like saying, I like listening to music, so I must be an auditory learner. Or I like watching TV, so I'm a visual learner. And that's really just, that's not the case. So I agree with you. It's more about what's the desired outcomes. How is whatever you're teaching, how is that best taught or illustrated or demonstrated? And use that as your guide rather than these arbitrary. And how do you even begin capturing what all of if you're a corporate trainer, you have thousands of, how are you going to even begin capturing all of their preferred learning styles and then try to create to it? It's unrealistic. So yeah. All
Absolutely.
right. Fantastic question, Karthik, kicking us off with I think the most classic learning myth that exists out there. All right. So our next question comes from Kayleen Holt. Hey, Kayleen. And Kayleen wants to know, should we bother with Bloom's taxonomy or just focus on teaching what learners need to be able to do? This is a good question. I have mixed feelings about Bloom's taxonomy and its usefulness, but I'm curious to know what you think, Kara.
Yeah, so from a higher education perspective, Bloom's taxonomy is still used in a lot of different programs. And the reason for it being used is a lot of kind of these standards that colleges are held to. So, for example, if you've heard of Quality Matters, some courses need to go through kind of those different guidelines in order to pass, in order to be put online. It does have something in there kind of about Bloom's taxonomy. So, I think that's why some of it still exists. But if you actually go back to like why Bloom's taxonomy was written, it was really focused on assessment, which is quite
Hmm.
interesting. It's not really focused like on learning, but more of the assessment piece of it. So, and if you think about this pyramid, right? I don't know about you, Tim, but I don't feel like I fit in a box or a pyramid. So I know like learning, I don't think is very linear, right? Like if we look at learning, it's
Yep.
kind of like a cycle and there's all these different things for it. So for me personally, like again, I do think it's really important to focus on what someone needs to do with the information that you're giving them, right? So for me, it's kind of yeah, it's not my thing.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm being honest, it it's useful to me to find some unique action verbs I didn't think of before. Kind of like a thesaurus is good for me to find different words. You know what I mean? But I haven't really spent a lot of time going, is my learner creating or analyzing or all of those different levels and trying to align it to that. So I agree with you in that sense. Yeah, absolutely. All right, fantastic. Okay, so our next question comes from Cheryl Oberlin. Hey, Cheryl, we all know you. Cheryl wants to know, does e-learning have to be interactive in order to be effective? I'll kick this one off. I mean, this one's in my wheelhouse. When I was, and I feel like I've said this line a million times before, but it's true. When I was brand new to the world of instructional design and e-learning, I remember constantly being bombarded by my peers and my boss at the time, telling me that in order to make my e-learning course effective, it needs to be interactive, or in order to make it engaging, it has to be interactive. And so at the time, I did all these weird contrived things to add interactivity to stuff that maybe didn't need to be interactive, but that's because I was told that's what it needed to be. So my opinion is no, it doesn't have to be interactive to be engaging or effective. I would say, does the content that you're teaching via that e-learning course, would it benefit from being interactive and help the learning point or help put skills into practice? Then yeah, but I think people sometimes have this idea that, you know, e-learning and interactivity are mutually exclusive and they always have to be combined. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Kara?
Yeah, so I think I got a mic drop quote on this, Tim. I want to say it's Tiagi
Okay.
that said this, but if you want to think about it, engagement is in the mind and not in the mouse,
Yeah.
right? So you really want to focus, if you're having something interactive, really focus kind of on the engagement piece. And I've done some research on engagement. And if you look up engagement, not only do you usually get pretty rings on Google, but then there's not really a good definition of what engagement means when it comes to learning. But if you dig through kind of the literature, it's kind of three constructs. One is behavioral, right?
Hmm.
So what is somebody kind of doing with the information? Cognitive, how are they kind of going through fitting it in the scheme of what they already know? But big one that I think finally is getting the love and attention that needs is this emotional one. Like, how does it make them feel? How are they
Yeah.
connected to it, right? And so I think if you can hit some of those elements when you're designing, it doesn't necessarily have to be interactive. There can be some really powerful stories or videos or things that you put in your learning experience that connects to somebody in a different way where they're not clicking uh, on their mouse and giving themselves carpal tunnel.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally, yeah. I think you bring up a really great point that what engagement is, it's relative. It's relative to the learner and the content, what you're teaching, and I like that it's in the mind and not, what was it, in the mouse is what you said?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's yeah, engagement is in the mind, not in the mouse.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Yeah. Engagement is not just clicking on a screen to reveal content. I really like that. All right, thanks for that question, Cheryl. All right, so our next question comes from Heather uh, Idrozo. I apologize if I got your name wrong, Heather. Heather wants to know, and this is similar to Cheryl's question a moment ago, do click to reveal interactions truly offer any value to e-learning? This is an interesting question because I literally just did a video and blog post on this topic this week. So I'll kick this one off and then jump in, Kara. Do click to reveal interactions offer value? This is another one that you'll see if you do spend any time on LinkedIn or Twitter. You'll eventually hear people say something like, no, click to reveal interactions offer no value. You shouldn't use them. It's just clicking. And I, it depends on how you're using them. In my opinion, if you're just using it for the learner to click and reveal content, that inherently doesn't really offer learning value. It's not the same thing as, say, a scenario based interaction or a performance based interaction where the learner's having to use their critical thinking skills. But I do think, in terms of the delivery of the content, if you're strategic, you can find value in a click to reveal interaction. Maybe you have a series of steps that are interrelated and you want the learner to explore each one in a particular order, or affinitize the information in some sort of meaningful way. Maybe it offers value. Or maybe you're providing support as part of a decision based interaction. Maybe the learner needs to complete a scenario, but they click to reveal additional content that might help them. That's an example of it. But I think where people struggle with click to reveal interactions is they add them thinking it's going to result in some sort of, miracle learning moment, when in reality, that's just not the case. It's just clicking to reveal information. The only thing the learner needs to know how to do is, click their mouse. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that, Kara?
I like the miracle
I
learning.
know.
Maybe we should focus on what that would be, right? So I will say, I think one thing it can do is I think it can get people to slow down a little bit,
Oh, I like
right?
that.
So instead of like racing through, it can help them kind of stop, pause, maybe reflect a little bit. But yeah, I'm exactly kind of on the same page as you, Tim. I do think that you need to proceed with caution with it. I don't think it equates to any great experience right out of the gate, but it's kind of how you use it. And also just another cautionary tale with like click to reveal and also like drag and drop. These can be an
Oh,
accessibility
yeah.
nightmare. So be very, very careful when using these. Depending on your organization, these may be no goes for certain standards of the web content accessibility guidelines. So you might want to stay clear of them.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, so it's less about whether or not click to reveal interactions are effective or ineffective. It's more about can you really define how you're using them and how it benefits the content. And then, of course, the accessibility question, I think, is an important consideration as well. All right, very good. Okay, so our next and final question comes from Jonathan Wilson. Hey, Jonathan. And Jonathan wants to know, is it true that classroom training is always more effective than online training? Gosh, I have some thoughts on this. I've actually written a blog post on this, but I'll let you kick this one off, Kara. What do you think about that?
Sure. I actually love this question a lot because this is something that's actually coming up kind of in my workplace too, because we do offer face to face still at an addition to e-learning. So I think really it comes down to knowing your audience, right? So really getting to know kind of what your training population needs and what they prefer. I think that's really important. But if you're in a situation where there may be some folks that maybe aren't computer literate and may have difficulty even logging onto a computer. And yes, there are people like that in work organizations, ladies and gents. So please don't think that that doesn't exist. Totally does, especially if people are working from home. They might want a break, they might want different things. So I think it depends, but I do also think you can absolutely be bored to tears in a classroom and e-learning, right? So I don't think either are unique in that sense. If you kind of ask the folks of how they prefer training, I think people will say, well, I could be bored kind of in either place. So again, I think it's depending on how you set it up. And I think classroom can offer a lot of like social elements that e-learning can kind of struggle with at times. So if you kind of have a social group, that might be something that you might want to do, but you can also put it in like a discussion board in an
Hmm.
LMS or like a flip grid. I've seen that have pretty good success as well. So it kind of depends on how you want to do it. But I guess the big one for me is just know your audience, see what they prefer, and is the topic something that would benefit from a more social element like a classroom.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think what I like about this question is it kind of alludes to a very common is trope the right word that I think, or one of the common pitfalls a lot of people run into. Usually at some point during the start of a project, somebody will say or ask or think, should this be an e-learning course or should it be an instructor-led training or should it be a job aid or should it be a how-to video? And my response is I always hate the mentality that learning is a binary choice between one thing or another. It's not e-learning or instructor-led training or job aid or a how-to video. And I remember when I in a previous job, I got hired to be a manager of an e-learning team. And I remember this classroom trainer came up to me and she asked if I was there to convert all of her training into e-learning. And I was like, no, we're here to maybe augment the experience and make it better or more blended. And so, yeah, to your point, Kara, I think it all depends on the content, the learning experience that you're creating. And of course, e-learning offers benefits that the classroom doesn't offer and vice versa. It all depends. It's not one thing or the other. All right. Well, that's all of our questions. I want to thank you so much, Kara, for joining me today. And if anyone wants to follow you online, LinkedIn, Twitter, where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me at Cara North 11 on LinkedIn or Twitter.
All right. Thank you so much, Kara, for joining me. And thank you, everybody who submitted a question today.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, that's all we have time for today. Of course, I want to thank Kara North for joining me to help me tackle those awesome questions. And as always, a big thanks to everyone who submitted a question for this month's episode. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube and you want to get alerted when we publish our next episode of Ask a Trainer, make sure to click that subscribe button below. And also, make sure to check out the ATD Ask a Trainer advice column by clicking on the link in the description. My name is Tim Slade, and until next time, I'll see you around.